Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, theater, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And a couple quick housekeeping items for today's episode. One, we had mentioned before a live podcasting event the week of Halloween in Florida, and we might have expected that to get postponed because of the pandemic, and it did. But we're working on an alternative, and we're working on a new date next year, with fingers crossed that everything will be okay by that date. So more news of that to come. Another cool item, this show just had its 2-year anniversary. This show's been going on for 2 years now, since August of 2018. It does not feel like it's been that long, but it has been. It's been a lot of fun. This is a great time to check out some episodes you missed. We have well over 50. I think, I don't know, maybe mid-50s, something like that. And so scroll through those, check some out that you might have missed. I think we had a lot of really fantastic cool ones, including today's episode. Today I get to talk with Dr. Joseph Van Gaalin. He is an expert in geology. He's an expert in oceanography. He holds a PhD and a master's in both, respectively. He works at Florida Southwestern State College in a bunch of roles, not only geology professor, but assistant vice president of institutional research, assessment, and effectiveness. And well, this episode had a kind of funny story about how it began. The essence of it is that there are real monsters in real nature, and they are just as terrifying and as fascinating as many of the fictional monsters we discuss in literature, film, and beyond, of course. But there are all sorts of actual events that have kind of mythic folktale monster stories behind them. Everything from Tunguska to ocean creatures like these terrifying sea monsters, right? So we get into all those. I also throw some fictional monsters at him that his geological or oceanographical expertise can help us sort out. I had a lot of fun with this episode. We go kind of long, but there's so many cool things to talk about that I think it's totally worth it. So rather than split this up into multiple parts, I say if you need to take a break, and then come back to it. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So let's go. So first off, thank you for joining me here on the Monster Professor, Joe Van Gaalin.
Great to be here. I'm glad to be a part of your show. I'm a big fan, actually.
Yeah, this episode came about. It had an odd genesis because you had reached out to me through Florida Southwestern State College about doing an event, a podcast live event. It was a really cool idea. As might be expected, the current situation's kind of closing down some live events, and we were chatting over Zoom about, how we might postpone it and what we might do. And then you started telling me these freaking scary stories about real things. And I'm starting to realize that your interest in monsters and the dark really merge with your expertise in geology and oceanography. You've got a PhD in geology, a master's in oceanography, and you've got all this horrifying information in your brain about monstrous nature and how scary the earth itself can be and how scary the oceans are. And then, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes into our casual conversation, I'm like, we got to stop and we got to record this thing as an episode because I want to go through these. So maybe first to give us a little bit of background on what got you into studying the oceans and the earth as you have, and how long have you realized you're also into the dark stuff?
Um, so actually, the dark stuff is probably easier to answer quicker because it actually goes back further in time. I can remember as a child, for example, there used to be like a monster matinee or something on Saturday afternoons. And so I can remember as young as like 5 or 6 years old, I'd be allowed to watch it so long as mom was in the room with me, you know. So I remember films like Alligator and Piranha. Um,
Yeah, I know those.
those, yeah, and very sort of B film, schlock film sort of stuff. I think, you know, I didn't know it at that age, but I'm sure my mom was like, this is fine because this is so bogus. You can't be scared by it kind of thing in a lot of it. So it's definitely like I was always interested in that kind of stuff, and it grew more with me over time. Like I remember being interested in things like Roswell, Bermuda Triangle, and this kind of stuff. And so there's always that kind of intrigue and mystery and these you know, certainly scary monster type of things and that sort of stuff. And dating back to this, actually how I first got into one of my sort of followings, which is Godzilla Films. At the time, the American version of the 1985 or 84, if you're from Japan, Godzilla film had just come out in theaters. And so I can remember there was a commercial on TV where Godzilla's foot comes out on the screen and crushes Bambi. And it's just, oh, you know, so I remember that. And then the other half of it, the oceanography world and the geology world, came a bit later. And I was on vacation one time with my family, and they had taken us on a cruise. At that time, all I knew about cruises was ships can sink, like the Titanic, you know. And so we went on this cruise, and while I was out there, I just remember being fascinated with being at sea and watching the waves and the water and that kind of stuff. And so that progressed into learning about the oceans and about how that works. When, you know, when your career starts to become part of it and this academia part comes out and you get all these different kind of questions, I sort of wander further and further into different places. And that's how I wound up in geology as well. I'll say one more thing about it, actually. It's kind of cool and depressing at the same time, because some of the things that were so cool to me when I was younger start to go away and are not as cool. It morphs into other things that I like very much, Monstrous and so forth, but some of them become easily explainable from the sciences. And the Bermuda Triangle is a good example. If you take a moment to look at the data, you'll find that you have no better likelihood of sinking in the Bermuda Triangle than you do anywhere else in the ocean. So, you know, other than a random weird story, which, you know, those happen in a lot of places, there's nothing particularly special about the Bermuda Triangle. And so, you know, that's a big disappointment, right? But I think that's probably a pretty good way to sort of get a sense of how I kind of think of them in my head a little bit, and how they've come to be for me.
Yeah, I guess that kind of finding out more about what could possibly be behind some of these like bizarre happenings that have occurred, that can kind of take the magic out of it a little bit. But I don't know, in other ways, sometimes it kind of opens new doors depending on how deep you want to look into it. I'm not really sure. I guess maybe that's one like unspoken, I don't know, principle or part of the ethos of this show is like digging into stuff but not losing the magic of the monsters.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I would say, I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, I think you make a good point because, you know, I sort of cheapened it a little bit too. I think sometimes when you learn about these things, you get a sense that there really are monsters out there. You know, one good example I can think of is the oarfish. And this is a creature that can be above 20 feet long. And for lack of a better description, it's a very long fish that's on the slender side. So, you know, from a distance, it kind of looks like this very long serpent-like creature. No doubt what we might define when we talk about sea serpents, these are what sailors might have seen in the past. And if you've never seen an oarfish, you know, it can be just daunting just because how big it is. Not to mention, part of what's creepier about them is not that they're big. I mean, you see a whale in the water and you're like, yay, a whale. And then you might be enthralled to see it, but it's not scary per se. It's certainly a monstrous creature. It's huge, but it's not really scary. It kind of lumbers about in the waves and so on. But an oarfish, its behavior is what makes it really strange and kind of spooky in that when they eat, they will sit vertical in the water. So these things
Oh my God.
20, 25 foot long fish will sit vertical. And so if you're, sailing along and you happen to see this guy way out in the middle of the ocean, and for whatever reason he happens to be closer to the surface, the water's nice and clear, you can see this thing, angling down. And so what makes it really then kind of scary is that, imagine yourself in the water, in the ocean, you're looking down at this creature that you see the head of it looking up at you. And that's what it's doing, because what it's doing when it's hunting like that is it sits vertical, because that way it can scout the silhouette of a fish that it's going to then eat, right? So this serpent is looking up at you from under the water. Probably his head is 15 feet underwater, so nice clear water, you can see that. And then the rest of his body is further down. And so for you don't know how big this thing is, because it just disappears into the void, into the darkness. And you've got this monster looking at you, right? And so it's a sea serpent, for lack of a better word. If you don't know the name of the fish, you can call it whatever you want, right? And it's without a doubt something that can really scare you quite a bit by seeing it for the first time.
You're scaring me right now, man. That's giving me chills thinking about this thing, because I've seen pictures of this thing and it's horrifying. It's like got this like terrible eel face, and like how long do these things get? Like 10, 15, 20 feet, something
Almost
like that.
30 feet. Yeah, and they do. You're right. They have their face has this weird sort of angler look to it, and they've got sort of they're not tentacles, but they look like little antenna and things and sort of spiny pieces that come out of it. So if it's staring at you, the famous one, if you go Google this right now, you can see a photo of these famous, I don't know, Navy SEALs or something who, this thing had been beached when it died. And they're, it's like 10 or 15 guys holding up a part of it, and they're really not doing it justice because it's laying flat. If you really wanted to do it justice, I suppose you'd have to hang it from a crane and imagine it, sitting there in the water column looking at you,
God, and those things, they like, I don't know, sharks fascinate people with how like terrifyingly effective they are as predators, but they are scary, right? But it's not scary in the same, they don't seem like dragon monsters to me. They just seem like these torpedo like I don't know, buzzsaws or something. But the oarfish looks like an ancient freaking dragon. It's absolutely horrifying. Like, even though one of the few times I was ever out on the ocean beyond the sight of land, it might have been just the only time I went out deep sea fishing with my family as a kid. And I look over the edge at one point and I see this jellyfish hanging around the boat. And I'm sure it was just like the magnification of the water and my huge imagination. But this thing was bigger than a car. And I was scared out of my wits. And I just decided I don't ever feel like messing with the ocean ever again for the rest of my life. And now if I saw this gigantic eel-like serpent just sitting vertically staring up at me with those cold dragon eyes, I don't think I would ever get my sanity back.
I used to tell people, because I have my scuba license, and people would say, oh, how come you don't go diving all that much? And, for me, I went to get my scuba license for what I was doing in my career. And I used to tell the people I would answer about that question, I used to tell them, I don't like things looking at me from 360 degrees. It's kind of funny, but when you think about it, in the water, there are creatures every direction, right? And they're looking at you from every direction. Like, I'll give you another example. When you're out at sea enough, and when I was doing my oceanography degree, I was out at sea a fair bit. You hear stories. These people tell, there's these famed stories these people tell, these kind of things. And there was one fella I was working out at sea with, and he had, this is 20 years ago, and he had probably 30 to 40 years experience out at sea working on different kinds of things that he was telling all these stories. And so these were all things from his career. And one story he told was he remembers, now you got to remember, so been out at sea, like you on a boat or whatever, you've got lights on that boat because you're doing something, you're fishing, right? And maybe you turn the lights off so that you can fish, but you always tend to have lights on. The Coast Guard kind of requires that, a little important, right? When you're out at sea with a research vessel, they'll try to darken up things as much as possible so they don't disturb the environment they're trying to look at. They're trying to explore things. So they still have lights on, safety and that kind of thing. But for the most part, it can be dark. So anyway, this fellow's telling the story about how one night, it was late at night, and he was out at sea and on a ship. And the ship is maybe a 100-footer or so, nothing huge. And he's out looking off the side of the railing of the ship, looking into the water, just sort of gazing out after a long day at work in the ocean. And he says, he saw the reflection of the moon in the water, and how pretty it was. He wished he had his camera to look at the reflection of the moon in water. And by the way, I'm telling you the story exactly as it was told to me. And then he says, but after a while, I realized that there was no moon in the sky. So what was I looking at? And it was at that point, he looked down again and he realized that he wasn't looking at a reflection of the moon. He was looking at an eyeball. And then it was at that point that whatever it was in the water just sort of skittered off, and he never saw another sight of it again. So when you're out at sea and see these kinds of things, very, very rapidly, you can become a novice very quickly if you've never been out there. You can have read all the books you want, but when you go out there and see one of these creatures in the blur of the water, in the darkness, whatever, you get these passing moments, and suddenly everything you're looking at kind of becomes, like Bigfoot. There was the joke, I forget the comedian in the 90s, he used to say, Mitch Hedberg, I think it was. He used to say, well, maybe a Sasquatch is just blurry. That's how he looks, because all the and it's kind of that way because the water makes things blurry when you look at them. So these creatures, you never get a real good grasp of these guys. And personally, I've been out at sea where we were towing this particular set of equipment out there, and it kind of looks like a torpedo off the back of the ship. So this thing's about 10 feet long. And you tow it down at depth, far enough in the water where you don't see it. And so when you're towing it back up, that's when the fun happens, because you tow it back up and slowly the thing becomes visible, right, to your eye as it's coming up from the depths. Yeah. And one time we towed it up, and I'm looking off the back of the deck of the ship to get it, and behind it, a little bit bigger than it, is something else trailing it. Now, from 15 feet in depth of water, really hard to say what it was. It could have been a really massive sturgeon because it kind of had that color, that sheen to it. But I've talked to people who've, worked with sturgeons a lot, and they say they kind of don't tend to get that big, but yeah, it's possible, So then what happens? You get those stories of the fishermen say, I caught a fish this big, and they really might have,
Yeah, well, since we're there, take me to the giant squid thing, because that's one of those, I don't know, the kraken-like monster that I remember hearing as a kid that these things weren't true. They were just drunken sailors. And then the more I looked into it, finding out, oh my God, they are true. Like, these things are gigantic, and then they can take down whales. And then I thought, maybe that's not true at all. I don't know. But I know for sure that if I were to see a squid capable of taking down a whale, that again, I would probably go instantaneously insane. But it makes you wonder, can they take down ships, and have they actually taken down ships before? What do you know about the giant? I can't even pronounce its correct name, so I'm just going to call it the giant squid.
Yeah, it's called the Architeuthis. So there are actually two kinds. So Architeuthis is one, that's what you're talking about, the giant squid. There's also something else called the Colossal Squid, although the genus and species name of that is lost for me at the moment. So colossal squid tends to be shorter in length. So like, think of it, we can simplistically imagine from the head to the tip of the longest tentacle, right? They tend to be shorter than the giant squid, but they're wider. They're bigger bodies than the giant squid. But a giant squid, you tend to see something in the range of 30, 40, 50 feet, something like that from head to toe, if you will. And so getting to the question you were asking, could it take down a ship? So this is something when you think about it, there's a lot of different sort of ideas you have to contemplate together. First of all, the creature itself. It's big enough to make itself quite a nuisance for a whale, right? I mean, a sperm whale that would typically eat these things, on the bigger end, a bull would be like 50, 60 feet. So you're dealing with a creature that can at times rival the thing that's going to eat it, right? And certainly rival it in a combative way, in the sense that it has a very powerful beak, and it also has a whole bunch of tentacles that the whale doesn't have, right? So it becomes a matter of how does the attack mode happen. There was a show back in, like, I don't know, Discovery Channel or something some years ago, where each episode was like, I don't know, an orca versus a great white, who would win, right? And all of those things came down to, how does the fight play out? Kind of like, if you think a boxing match, you can put Ali and Foreman in the ring, and if Foreman gets a good clean shot on you, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going down, right?
Yeah.
But if you're Ali and you can maneuver yourself in a way that really avoids that shot all the time, you're safe, right? So it's the same sort of thing with the giant squid and the sperm whale. How does it attack? And a sperm whale will sort of, like, I don't want to say swoop through. It's not like it's flying, but it will swim very rapidly through where it sees the squid to be, and then, make a sort of a sneak attack, if you will. Meanwhile, the squid will be constantly maneuvering. So again, back to your question, I still haven't answered it yet. Could it take down a ship? If you go back in time, sure, it's possible. You could argue, for example, and maybe this is another topic we could talk about, Moby Dick comes from a true story. And when you read the pages of the true story that it talks about, where Moby Dick comes from, if you have a sense of an oceanography background, you might get an idea of what was possibly happening, which was the whale may have, and again, this is sort of like a little bit of speculation, because it's not like you can ask the whale, but may have mistaken the hull of the ship for another whale. A bull will, it's a territorial thing, so they will fight each other and they will bash heads with each other. And when you find out, historically, we can josh to the side of that in a bit, I suppose. Talk about whales and the sperm whales and what they do. They will, like rams, they'll headbutt each other. And that's what the true story of the Moby Dick, that's what happened. It headbutted the ship several times, even knocking itself unconscious while it did it. And so when you think about that, a whale can mistake the hull of a ship. Back in the 1800s and 1700s, it can mistake that. A ship today is steel and massive and doesn't make sense for a sperm whale, but a ship, something like 70, 80 feet long, 60 feet long from the underwater, it's got the bulbous sort of shape of a whale. And if you had a few oars sticking out of it in a nice location, perhaps, right? You've heard the stories of a shark mistakes a surfer for a seal, this kind of thing. So it's very possible you could have a squid take a look at one of these things from the underside and take the combative approach of protecting itself before it can be targeted by the whale, or really ship in this case, and clasp itself around the ship and attack. Did that really happen? Well, of course, now you're starting to get into that myth and folklore and legend kind of thing. But certainly you can see some of these things sort of make sense.
Yeah, and so Ahab was right then when Starbucks is like, "Hey man, it's just a dumb animal. Why do you have to take it so personally?" And Ahab, to paraphrase his awesome speech in a much more mundane way, is something more like, "Nuh-uh, that thing came after me. It came after us, just like nature is coming after us. I have to strike back at it all." So it could very well, they could have just been out there in the ocean, and this whale decided, "I'm going to attack your ship and bring it down." That's so great. And there's another, I don't even know what my question is about this, but something about this squid, especially a giant squid, has always freaked me out, that it has a beak. This is not the same evolutionary line as a bird, right? Did the beak evolve independently on the squid? Why does a beak exist in the ocean? This doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, I mean, when so now you're asking a question that's more along the lines of evolution. And so when you ask that, you start to get in this idea of that you can have different lines of evolution, and one, the animal is evolving towards something in its environment or its condition that makes it start to look that way, right? The geomorphic, not the geomorphic, but the morphology of it starts to look that way because of the what it's dealing with there. And so that can happen with that creature. And if other creatures are dealing with the same sort of phenomena, but in a different place, it's very possible that it can look like that, very similar. So it's a completely different genetic line, but yet very similar. And these are the kinds of things, if you go and talk to folks who do that kind of work, they're finding that they start to do a lot of work in comparing the DNA lines of these things versus where they used to, the way they used to, structure the evolutionary pathways is looking at the morphology, the structure of these creatures. And now they can test it. And in many cases, they were right. But every once in a while, they were wrong. And so when you look at a creature, just look at a whale, for example, just a couple different types of whales, and imagine the different things that you have with a whale, right? So you've got something like a humpback whale, right, where you have baleen, which, I suppose you could call them teeth, but not really. It's more like eating through a toothbrush, where what they do is they sort of gulp in a whole bunch of water and they sift out the water, much like you might in a pool, where, if you stuck up a little water in your mouth and you try and squirt it through the gap in your teeth as a child, right? So it's kind of sort of that way. And then you have a sperm whale that's got teeth. I mean, and so it has to do with what they're up to, what they're hunting, the evolution that they're dealing with. And really, even when you look at the organism itself, again, with the whale for a moment before we even hit the giant squid, you look at the way they're evolved makes them quite dangerous in their own way. If you were, for example, to get pinged by a whale, so they've got echolocation and these other sorts of sonic capabilities. If you were in the water next to this guy and you would get, clicked, as they call it, it can be quite painful, because
Really? Just the echolocation hurts?
Yeah, well, when you're talking about a whale like that, you're knocking these things at about 200 and something decibels. So, when you think a jet airplane is at 100 decibels, 110 maybe, race cars are maybe 110, 120. So, yeah, it can be absolutely deafening.
My God.
Yeah, it's just pretty crazy when you have to think about how dangerous can animals be in their own way. And it's not a common thing to think about because, let's be honest, how often do you go hop into water with a sperm whale, right? It doesn't happen all that often. And then the whale's not trying to kill you. The whale's trying to see you. And so it'll click you. And then, I have heard stories, for example, of scuba divers being in the water where they'll have their arms out at some sort of direction, and then the sperm whale will click them, and then they basically get paralyzed for about 10, 15 seconds. Simply because the sonic blast is so much, it sort of shocks the muscles a little bit and can be really sort of kind of a scary thing. And so with the squid, like I said, I wandered around quite a bit here, but the beak becomes a case of what's it going after, right? What's it eating? Just the same as any other creature. Why does animals have eyes on the side of their head instead of the front of their head? And the answer is because of what they're dealing with. The animals with the eyes in the front of their head, if their eyes are really wide apart, they're a really good predator, right? Because they've got eyes further apart, that gives them better depth perception. If they've got eyes on the side of their head, that means they're probably prey. And so they literally want to see what's behind them, have eyes on the back of their head kind of thing. So a bird, when it's looking at you, is, it's giving you a profile view of itself because one eyeball is looking straight at you. The other eyeball, mind you, is looking completely in the other direction, but one eyeball is looking at you, right?
Well, you say like, well, because how often do you like go swimming with sperm whales or so? Well, I can guarantee you never again. In fact, I'm rethinking ever coming down to Florida for an event with you guys because it's too close to the ocean because you're scaring me right now, Joe. Man, well, how about, let's just do a completely awkward segue and jump into scary rocks and stuff because so something you were telling me about when we were first chatting, it was like this, and I think what hooked my mind is I had heard something about this story before, and I think it was Cameroon. And it was like the angel of death came through this village at night, and it like killed everybody in their sleep, or like hundreds and hundreds of villagers, and then just went away mysteriously. So like the next morning, everybody's dead except for some. And you were filling me in on the details, and then let me know how this might have happened without the hand of the angel of death itself, like Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, but which is that scene in that movie still scares me because they don't really do any sound, just this horror, just like this long quiet like screams in the background, and that's it. It's a pretty scary moment when like the fog of death is coming through. So fill us in on what happened when this whole village just got mysteriously murdered overnight.
Yeah, so you're right. I'm pretty sure that was Cameroon, and it's one of those things where I don't want to say it's very common, but that's far from the first example of it. It's just the first example with a lot of death involved. But that type of thing can happen quite often. So you've got you can imagine volcanoes, right? And then you can imagine other places that are geothermal, right? So think of Yosemite. Sorry, not Yosemite, Yellowstone. Put a Y in there and I start to go in a different place, right? So anyway, Yellowstone, we go there as tourists and see the animals and see Old Faithful and this kind of thing. And we very often forget that these things are related. Hawaii and the volcanoes in Hawaii and Yellowstone are not all that different. The only difference is one is underneath the continental plate, and that's Yellowstone. And so, but that geothermal activity is what's feeding Old Faithful, for example, and the other geothermal activities going on there. And so we think of volcanoes like Hawaii, but we have to remember that just because they're not exploding and constantly, sort of flowing liquid over the side, lava over the side, doesn't mean they're not active in other places in other ways. So like Yellowstone, when you walk through, you can find places that are bubbling or smoking and this sort of thing. And you might think of it like a volcano that's belching instead of exploding, right? And so in the case of the story you're talking about, you had a lake that was up a ridge, so uphill from this village, and underneath the lake was a place, a fissure, where you'd have gases that are being emitted from some geothermal activity. By the way, this is also, if you go to Yellowstone, there is a lake, and the bottom of the lake is actually rising. It's going up, it's growing. You just Google Yellowstone volcano, and every 6 months you'll see an article, oh my God, it's gonna blow, any minute kind of thing. They talk about it, right? So there's always activity. So anyway, so this gas was sort of belching up and coming up, and since it's less dense than the water, it bubbles up to the surface, just as you might imagine. And then it is more dense than the air, though, so it's not going to readily spill out. So what happens is equivalent to what would happen in your shower. If you've got a shower you turn on in the morning in the hot water, and then you close the shower door and leave the shower running for a while, then watch your mirror. And so you'll see your mirror in the bathroom fogs up from the top down, right? Because the heat is escaping out of the top of the shower and then working its way down because the hot air is less dense, right? So in this case, it's more dense. So what happens is it sits right above the water of the lake, and then eventually there's enough of it that it's just bubbling up and bubbling over the side of the ridge. And so it found a pathway to flow down the side of this ridge the same way water would flow down the side of it. And it's also not visible, this particular gas. Usually sulfides is what's associated with it. And so the scary part of this was, of course, everybody was sleeping. And so then the spooky part becomes only the people who were awake didn't die. So there was maybe one or two people who were up and about in the evening, weren't sleeping, therefore were not low to the ground, and they were standing up. And even if they were laying down a bit, perhaps they were standing up in between. They might not realize that they were getting a slight headache, so that's why they stood up, perhaps, or who knows, to go get a drink, who knows. And so all the people who were laying down at the lower elevations, children as well, and dogs, cats, these sorts of things, they all go in the night as this thing sort of passed. And whether it would have been a daytime, the same thing would have happened. But if everybody was awake and walking around, you may not have noticed. The dogs or the animals low to the ground, perhaps, you'd see them go. But other than that, it'd just be a completely sort of different story. So you get a lot of these certainly, without a doubt, these are the kinds of things that can inspire absolute horror stories, these crazy sort of things. Just like, Moby Dick was inspired by the whale ship, the Essex, that I had mentioned to earlier. This sort of thing too can really be something that you can find in stories around the world.
Yeah, God, it's yeah, because if this would have, I don't know, if this would have happened, just a few centuries back, and definitely a couple millennia back, but just a few centuries back, and that would have been the angel of death, and that would have been all there was to it. But, since it happened more recently, we can go, oh, you just all got poisoned invisibly in the night, but you just said this kind of stuff can happen all the time, man. Now I'm getting more and more frightened as this podcast goes along. So let me just throw some other stuff that terrifies me that has to do with the earth and ocean. One of them, I'm pretty sure, I know I didn't find this news story again, prepping for this talk to confirm it, but I know I had heard it. Some dude down there in Florida, you guys have some crazy news stories down there, by the way. You have a reputation for Florida man kind of stuff, but some dude down there in Florida was just, sleeping in his bed, in his bedroom, in his home, in a neighborhood, in the middle of the night, and then just like in Nightmare on Elm Street #1 with Johnny Depp, he gets sucked down into the earth, and then I forget who finds out or who calls rescue teams, and they're digging into this sinkhole that just opened up under his bed in the middle of the night. And at the time of reading the story, they didn't quite recover his body, and they were just pretty sure he was dead under there. I'm sure since then they had kept digging until they could recover his body. Was that total BS, or does this kind of stuff happen? Do I need to worry about a sinkhole opening up under my bed at night and like the earth swallowing me?
So, yeah, I mean, that was about 2 hours north of where I live here in Florida. Matter of fact, if you do get a chance to do the homework to find the article, you'll eventually find me on the news. They interviewed me about it.
Oh, no kidding. This is your second interview about it.
Yeah, there you go. Now, I'm becoming slowly famous about it, right? So in this case, it's a real deal. And what happened to him is his house was built, unfortunately, on top of what became what's known as a cover collapse sinkhole. And so there are lots of different types of sinkholes. That one is the one that can just go foop, and suddenly there's a void, right? But there are others too where, just the land mass around is kind of slowly sinking, hence the name, right? And a matter of fact, if you look in the central sort of areas of Florida, towards like Disney World and these types of places, you find a lot of those slow sinking holes, sinkholes. And in those, there's very often what are known as dissolution sinkholes. So things, the material is dissolving underneath, and so slowly everything is subsiding. And so when you go there, you don't realize you're looking at sinkholes because you call them lakes, right? They're just filled with water. And so there are a lot of lakes in the area, and that's what they are. They're, for the most part, they are sinkholes. And in this fellow's case, I don't recall them ever finding the body, frankly. I think once the collapse happened, he was just, covered up by all that was around it. I don't know that ever would have found it. Because the thing about a cover collapse sinkhole is, as the name sort of hints to a little bit, is so you build a house, you're building it on this landmass, and that's the cover. Underneath the cover is what is dissolving. And so that which is dissolving is holding up the landmass that house is sitting on. So eventually when you dissolve enough, suddenly there's nothing to hold up that cover, and then it collapses suddenly, rapidly. And that's very dangerous. Good news, of course, is that's something that's tracked readily and has readily available data with the United States Geological Survey. You can go on their webpage and kind of find out, I want to buy a house. Where do I not want to build one, right? You can sort of pick the areas and towns and cities and these kind of things where I'm not gonna go and do that kind of thing there. If you have a whole boatload of money on your hands, you could hire geological specialists, geotechs and firms and things like that to go out. They won't, depending on the state and the law, they won't necessarily sign off that it's safe, but they can give you peace of mind that you're in pretty good shape, or hey, maybe that's not a good idea, because they can get a glimpse of what's underneath the surface. They actually use the same type of equipment to do that as they would if they were, looking for Jimmy Hoffa or that kind of thing. It's the same sort of equipment they do to use that, to do that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, and so you think they haven't even found the body again. God, that is, I know. So maybe this is an example of like finding out more about it doesn't necessarily take the magic away, at least not for me, because I get how these kinds of things happen, but I can't help but wonder, well, why that guy? What did he do? Was he playing with a Ouija board or something like that? Like you explained how it can happen, but that doesn't explain why him or why that. And so that's going to continue to stay terrifying for me. You didn't give me any peace of mind at all, Joe. So
Sorry.
How about this is one I'd heard a few theories on, and I think I've heard kind of the consensus, but I don't know for sure. It's this thing that happened in 1908, if I'm remembering correctly, and it's shown up in so many stories. It might have even shown up in some of my stories. It was a minor plot point in like Hellboy and even like The Tick or something. And Tunguska, something happened in 1908, and there was just this gigantic, mysterious explosion. And everybody's got all these weird theories about what it might be. What's the official diagnosis of what happened in this bizarre explosion that just wiped out miles and miles of Siberian wilderness?
Yeah, so yes, you're right. So Tunguska event, and I always get it messed up if it was 1906 or 1908. I don't know.
Oh.
One of them is the year the Cubs won the World Series before recently, right? But so yeah, I think the first thing to do when we think about this is just to give you a little bit of perspective. So just imagine yourself late at night, outside, looking up at the sky during the meteor showers, and just wow, what it would be like to see one of those meteors up close that's making this brilliant streak across the sky. And I want to take a picture, but I never can take a picture because it just goes too fast, and just know that when you're seeing that streak across the sky, you're looking at something that is roughly the size of a marble. That's it. These things tend to be very small, and that's why they make this lovely streak. Is something the size of a marble is just going to burn up on its way in, and so that beautiful streak, little tiny marble that you're seeing from miles and miles away, streaking like crazy. Sometimes a little bit bigger than that. But anyway, so just to give you a little perspective, we see these things. Now, when you see something like a massive explosion, something from space, something from sky, so next thing to do when you want to think about it is look at the moon. And so, you can see the man in the moon and all the craters and the wonderful things. And then you say, well, where are they on Earth? Well, they're here. They're all here. They're still here. They're here on Earth. It's just that we have these other things that hide them really, really well, right? Like these green things we call trees and grass, right? And all this other stuff. And if you go longer in time, Earth does a good job of erasing them because of plate tectonics, the geological processes that are, for lack of a better word, they're dead on the moon. They are very much alive here. And so those things erase a lot of the evidence of impacts and these kind of things. We can find a few of them still out there, some of the more massive ones. For example, the one that is the hypothesis is that it wiped out the dinosaurs. That one's out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, Chicxulub, is that one?
Yeah, Chicxulub, I think. Yeah, that's right.
Chicxulub. Yeah.
And so, those are types of, so I'm getting this long story here. I'm going to try and narrow it down here, so bear with me. But so how do we as scientists kind of look at that and figure out what happened, right? When you want to see something that blew up, how do you do that, right? A crime scene investigation looking at a bombing, they come in and look for parts of the bomb, right? A geologist comes in, something like this, and they look for parts of the impact, right? What is it? Was it a meteor? What happened? And so what you come up with, for example, in Chicxulub is you can match this layer of iridium that is around the entire planet. So this thing, when it hit, was massive enough that it shot out a layer of iridium around the globe and laid it down on the ground. And then it was preserved in the geologic record. And so we can match that. That is, by the way, what we call the KT boundary, which is between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary, or what you know as the end of the dinosaurs. So we can match that, and that lines up quite nicely. What happens when we don't find any evidence? So there's basically two pathways you can go, which is, okay, there's no evidence. So we can say, here are some examples of what no evidence is, which is, it could be a comet, which is mostly ice, right? And so that's just going to go away. If there's still ice when the impact happens, well, then it's going to be a big impact, but then it disappears, right? There was a great sci-fi sort of horror movie that was based on a story, and I cannot remember the name of the author. Maybe you can help me with it. But the movie and the book was called A Sound of Thunder. Does that sound familiar to you?
I'm blanking on that.
So this is a very short version here, is that they make this time machine so they can go back in time and hunt dinosaurs, but they don't want to mess up their present day by messing up the past. So they go back and they shoot ice guns in the movie. So that way, when they kill the Tyrannosaurus or whatever, there's no evidence. It's just, melted ice is water, so who cares, right? That in and of itself is a farce, because the water, the ice itself, would carry all sorts of things that wouldn't have been there. Anyway, so we'll get another story there. But so this is the kind of thing that suddenly breeds these events. Like, well, what could it be? There is some evidence of some material there with Tunguska, but not enough to make the massive impact. So there's where the mystery is. But largely then you could surmise, okay, a lot of ice, which makes for a lot of the impact to disappear, and then a little bit of iron and some other things that were left there as well. But it doesn't match up with the whole size of the event. And so those are, again, a lot of those types of things that we see in our world. Don't get me wrong, I think it's great to see these kinds of, well, great in not a dangerous way for people, but great to see all these amazing, monstrous sort of things happen. But when we have to look at it from a scientific perspective, the answer is not as fun, because the answer is just, well, we don't know. And here's some of the things it's likely to be, but we can't say for sure because we don't have enough evidence. So a best example I can give you is that, we look at Bigfoot and Megalodon perhaps in a little bit different light, right? Because Bigfoot, people can say, well, it's not really, there's a little bit more legend and myth to it. And Megalodon, well, this is something we know, in the fossil record, it was there once before, so maybe it's still there, right? Whereas Bigfoot kind of doesn't quite make sense in that perspective even, although depending on the story you hear, right? And so you can trace them back in two different ways. In the Megalodon's case, we can do studies on food webs and things like that and say, well, there's not enough for the Megalodon to eat, and it doesn't make sense in the niche. So why would it be here? So it simply doesn't make sense that it's around. So that solves that story. In the case of the Bigfoot, same pattern exists. The same evidence, or lack thereof, I should say, is there with the Bigfoot. The difference, though, is that in one case, in the Megalodon, you have a prior scientific record. In the other, you have a historical record of stories. And Bigfoot is that example where you've got, these stories that were told and passed down in generations, but it's not clear what exactly they were talking about. So some have said, oh, that's Bigfoot, see, there you go. And others have said, well, no, you're misinterpreting the way the story was written. I think, for example, in my mind, back to one of your earlier episodes where you talk about the abyss in the Bible and how the abyss, the word I think you said was tehom, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, tehom, the abyss, the void, that matches up with the Mesopotamian dragon, Tiamat, linguistically or etymologically.
Yeah, and so that's a great example. Just like Bigfoot, some of the stories that are told could very easily have been interpreted in somewhat different ways. And before you know it, you have very different things.
Yeah. Well, I can tell that you're a teacher because you teach very well. You explain you lay out your explanations and your comparisons in really visual and tangible ways. So you're a really good teacher, Joe, by the way. Uh, but I must also say that I'm a bad student because all I really got out of that Tunguska explanation was that I'm still allowed to think it was an interdimensional portal that opened up from the Agdru Jahad or Cthulhu or something.
I'll go with you on that one because I like to think about monsters too. So until we find other evidence, we're just going to go with that. It was Cthulhu's flashlight or something.
So maybe I can start to veer away a little bit from things that we can look at purely rationalistically and scientifically, and then you put your geological and expertise to use by throwing some monsters at you and some purely fictional stuff at you.
All right.
How about one? Are you aware of one of the greatest films of all time called Tremors?
Yes.
I I only like half jokingly call it one of the greatest films of all time. I don't know. I think it's maybe I should just back up and say it's just a perfect film for it does what it needs to do so
It's a
wonderfully.
surface topper for sure.
Yeah, but something that always confused me is would it be possible for a giant worm-like creature to crawl through the earth in this almost like ocean swimming-like way? Like they bring in their geological expert. I think they should have brought you in, by the way. But they bring in theirs, and she like offers this vague explanation about like how the soil is looser in the valley, and it has these tiny little, I don't know, studs on the side that push it along, even though it's this whale-sized worm-like thing. Would that, is that viable? Could that really happen if such a creature were to exist in a place like that?
You'd end up reaching this sort of maximum for the animal in terms of being able to churn the material around. So like worms, for example, small worms, they already do that, right? You can find them in the soil and they can dig around in the dirt a little bit and do that kind of thing. The problem that you'd have with making a creature large is more or less the same problem we see in a lot of different creatures, whether you're talking about giant monsters where the physics doesn't make sense of it being able to hold up its own weight with the bone structure it has, or if you look naturally speaking, you can find historical records, geological history rather, of insects that were, the size of your head, quite a bit back in time and larger still. And the reason that they were really big back then and not big now, I mean, they're still pretty big in Florida, mind you, but not nearly as big, has to do with the limitation to this environment, just the same as we talk about like with the tremors. So like in the case of the insects, the insects breathe through their bodies. They don't have lungs like we do, right? Now, if you step outside of insects a little bit, you look at a spider, they have something called a book lung, which is sort of this like halfway lung, not quite what we use. But so if you think about it, then the insect breathes through its body, then this is problematic getting large because you have a volume to surface space issue after a while. And you simply can't sustain enough of that volume with how much air you can fit through that surface. So why were the insects bigger back in time? And the answer is because back then there was more oxygen in the atmosphere than there is now. So presently there's 21% in the atmosphere. If you go back in the time of the dinosaurs, it was about 30%. So there's more air to mess with. So you can be, as an insect, you can be larger purely because you're not limited by that factor anymore. And so then it is beneficial perhaps for predatory reasons to be larger. So in the case of tremors, it's possible to get larger than a worm that you imagine in your front lawn or something, but certainly nothing on the size that you see in the movies. They do a really good job of sort of washing it away, kind of like they do if you stick a grown man inside an iron suit and you make him fly around and he hits a wall at 400 miles an hour. That's okay somehow, an Iron Man. But so they sort of like, oh yeah, he's got padding in there or something. I don't know. And you kind
No,
of
he would have been a dude smoothie inside that suit, like 20 minutes into
absolutely.
his own movie. Well, how about let me throw another one at you. It's this. I think it really starts. The idea of it really starts getting spread around. I don't know, early 1800s. Sims holes, Symmes, after the guy who like took seriously this concept. It showed up in some Edgar Allan Poe. I think a narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. I think Lovecraft played with it in one way or another. But this concept that the Earth is hollow, you have the surface of the Earth on this outer shell, and the outer shell ends some miles in, and then what you have is this like internal world. And so the bottom of the Earth shell that we're standing on is the ground for this other world, it's and then there are two access points at the poles, both covered in ice. But if you could like get through the ice in the Arctic, for instance, you could reach the Sims hole where you could go down from, take the travel around from this side to the other side of the hollow Earth. What is a geologist's perspective on this concept that many people took seriously for a while, and I think still fascinates a lot of fiction writers, but I don't know what the expert thinks about this craziness.
Well, I think I would be lambasted by my colleagues if I didn't immediately say it's nonsense. So I start there, but let me spin it around from the monster realm first and say, I think it's a fun sort of thing to think about because the latest Godzilla movies, that's their explanation, right? Where did these massive creatures we never knew about for all the human history, where were they? Oh, well, they were in a big hole in the ground, And so they have a geologist in there that just, I'm sure, makes all geologists around the world cringe to explain this away, and it makes perfect sense. And there you go, the monsters are in there and so on. And another thing, I mean, even with Sims himself, when he was alive and sort of putting himself out there with this, there's one famous case now when we have the letters or something for it, where there's some speculation now that they think that the scientists that he was interacting with thought they were interacting with a child when they were talking to Sims, because that's how silly some of the ideas were that he was saying. When you go back in time, certainly it's harder to dispute what he's talking about. What he's trying to say is what's going on under the earth. It's more difficult back then when we had less knowledge than we do now about what's going on with the earth. But today, for example, I mean, no, not even remotely close. We know a whole lot about what's underneath the earth and what it looks like down there. And we do, for the same reason and with the same technology that we know what's going on in your brain. You go get a CAT scan and the tomography images that they use, tomographic images they use for that is the same concept as what we do to look in the earth and what's underneath it. Another example is, the military and pretty much air traffic control around the world has no problem using radar to make sure your planes don't crash into other planes. So, we know it works really well. And we use it to look underneath the ground too and get reflections off of the subsurfaces under there. So we know quite a bit about that. And Sims, in his case, perhaps admirably to some end, he was trying to explain some things that were, hard to understand and hard to figure out back then, which was these things called magnetic anomalies. So, this idea that there were these multiple poles, and if you go, so there were 4 poles instead of 2, and if you, Sims was trying to make sense of the concept that the magnetic poles seem to move. And so perhaps the best way I can explain this is to say that probably in your 8th grade textbook of science, when you got it, it gave you the same bogus explanation of the Earth's magnetic field that they sort of understood back then. And that helps to perpetuate the nonsense of the hollow Earth today, which is, and we do it, by the way, it cheapens the science of it, but it makes it a little easier to comprehend at first. Everybody knows what a magnet looks like, and whether it's a U-shaped magnet from a cartoon or this bar magnet, you've seen it before. So in these textbooks, they make a nice little picture of the globe, and then they stick a picture of a bar magnet in the center, stick it north and south, and go, there you go, kids. That
I
is not
remember some of those actually.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean that's not even remotely close to reality. We're dealing with something called a geodynamo, and it's liquid iron down there that's spinning around crazy, and so the magnetic field spins around crazy. It really is crazy for Earth's time period, but for human time span, it sort of slowly spins, and therefore we kind of think of it like it doesn't make sense that it would sort of oscillate, but we know it does quite well. Any nautical chart you go by, you have to go buy a new one 10 years later because they'll adjust a little bit, ever so slightly, for those changes that happen. And so anyway, so like I said, Sims is admirable in one sense, but his ideas and ways to explain it are kind of a little bit in left field. But his story is very similar. When you look back and you get people who say, you know, how old the Earth is, there's a number of different answers that have come up through time. And one of them is, I believe, is about 40 million years old, which is quite a bit off of the 4.6 billion. And that stems from, you probably heard of him in your science class somewhere in the past, Lord Kelvin. And so this fellow is known as Absolute Zero guy. He's the guy that figured that out. But what he also did was be able to estimate the age of the Earth based on its cooling, which is exactly how we do it today. So he did some calculations and figured out it's about 40 million years. The only problem was he had no idea about radioactive decay at the time, and so his calculations were off. But if we do this exact same concept, what he was doing, we do it today, we come up with 4.6 billion, which makes a lot more sense with all of the other solar system bodies and so on.
Yeah. So is it even possible to have like a large hollow spaces in the Earth without it being crushed, or like, I don't know, the gravitational pressures or all the other kind of liquid iron, everything you've got going on down there, if you get really deep in it, could a hollow space even exist very long?
Well, so once you get down, depending on where in the Earth you are, whether it's about 50 miles down to several hundred miles down, and into ranging towards 1,000 miles down, you're fading slowly from rock to something that behaves a little bit more like a plastic. And so it sort of, kind of moves around slowly. And then you get into further down, you get into a harder core again, outer core, and then a liquid inner core. So is it possible to have voids in there? Sure. We have voids in lots of different places. There's, matter of fact, underneath me here in Florida, there is a section about 1,700 feet down, depending upon what part of Florida you're talking about, called the Boulder Zone. And so when you go down that far, and we've got wells that are drilled down that far, you get down where, it's, imagine exactly what you'd think. It's, dirt followed by more dirt, followed by more rock, followed by more rock. And then all of a sudden you get into this spot where it's kind of the open voids and big enough that you could wander around down there. Without the well, you'll never get out because there's no opening to the surface. But there are these voids down there, and they're big enough to wander around in, but not big enough for Godzilla. But certainly, I suppose it's possible in different areas. And depending on the rock, it wouldn't be crushed, again, by the way you build it. If you go underneath Michigan, for example, there's plenty of huge voids there that humans built. And we went in there, we dug underneath there, and the massive salt mines that are down there, if you go in there, they have these massive dump trucks with those wheels like the ones that are like 10-foot diameter tires on them, those kinds of trucks. Those things are down there, and they build it properly with support in different areas so that the thing doesn't completely collapse. So for sure, you can have voids quite large. It's not impossible, but they're certainly not at all a hollow earth in the way Sims imagined by any stretch of the imagination, and certainly not a hollow earth in general. But without a doubt, you can have some pretty big voids down there, sure.
Well, then how about this one in case anyone's wondering? Dr. Joseph Van Gaalin, is the Earth flat?
I still can't decide if the people who say that just want attention or they really think that. I mean, even Christopher Columbus knew that it wasn't. That's the story they tell, but that's nonsense. They knew it for quite a bit longer than that. So I don't know, I don't know why you sort of see those kinds of things. I think that's perhaps something more for a study in sociology. Yeah, those sort of stories of how they perpetuate it. And that to me is what was in the beginning for your podcast so fascinating to me, was seeing how all these sort of things connected, and it made a lot more sense. The one that sticks out in my mind is the berserker concept. I wasn't familiar with that, and the werewolf and all that, and the sort of connectivity with that. You had a guest on talking about that at one point too. I can't remember the fellow's name, but those sort of connections are so fascinating to me.
Yeah, and you brought up a couple of times that you've been listening to the podcast for a while, which was really cool to find out. And I found out recently that you got my novel The Black Palace as a Christmas gift, which seems like a curse or an evil Christmas gift. It seems like something that a dark book about witches and these kinds of things doesn't belong on Christmas, but maybe it does. And you hit me with some really intelligent and observant questions about the book, and so I was really impressed with how close and sharp of a reader you are. And so maybe, since you know a little bit about the stuff I played with, maybe I can have you fact check me on some stuff or give me some advice if I were to ever go in and fix it. So I have a golem in my book, one of these creatures out of Jewish folklore, in which we create a man out of stone, or other versions he's out of clay, or sometimes hardened clay. I make him out of the same stone that the commandments were carved into from Aqaba, in my own fictional mythology of how it all worked. But you have a much better concept of minerals and their properties. So if you and I were to make a golem, Joe, and we had to decide on which kind of rock we wanted to carve this man out of before we brought him to life, what would you recommend we use for a golem?
Well, first I got to say that character was immensely entertaining and frustrating at the same time in that script. Because he was this really powerful sort of guy, but he reminded me of Bobby's World, which sort of takes things literally, and so you're like, yay, the golem's gonna do something, and like, oh, where are you going, you moron,
He follows orders.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, those chapters when we got to him. I think the first thing that comes to mind, I think also when it comes to that story, you masterfully wove all these pieces together, where you got to the point in the book where you're just accepting every sort of, fantastical thing that happens at that point. You did such a good job of creating the world that now we're in it for the long haul, right? And so we're just accepting everything. Oh yeah, guy made of dirt, no problem, let's go. But I guess, like, from my perspective, the first thing that comes to mind would be clay. Because with clay, it's a funky sort of molecular level, a kind of the way it behaves. And so if you were to press your hands think of it, if you don't have clay, you can do it with mud. Even if you press your hands in the mud, it's harder to pull your hand out of the mud than it is to pull your hand sideways out of the mud, right?
Yeah.
So that has to do with the shape of the crystalline structure of the clay or of the mud itself. And so the way the cohesion works with the water and the particles is why it behaves that way. And so I suppose in a sense it's kind of magical if we can't look at it on the surface. On the surface, superficially, I should say, in a simplistic way. But to me, that's the first thing that I go with is clay. And I think it's also, clay can be the kind of thing that can be very magical in a story in that way, because it's very easily adaptable in a playful way, in an exploratory way, not unlike magnets, for example. We talked about earlier, you can easily get someone stumped very quickly by asking them, how does a magnet do that? What is that force you feel when you try to force two positives together, two negatives together? You're feeling this force. It's pushing you apart. It's like magic. It's invisible, what is this crazy thing? And, so you could very quickly get people sort of, confused by it. And then if you dig a little deeper, you find that it's the same forces that you feel that are the forces that are extremely common to you. For example, you have no problem accepting the fact that when you tried to walk through your doorway and it didn't work because the door was shut, you don't question this whatsoever. You hit the door, it hurt, you open the door, right? But it's the same concept. The same forces are at work. It's just that with the magnets, the forces are amplified. And so those forces, for lack of a better word, extend beyond the body that you're looking at. And so you see it beyond where you'd normally be okay, accepting the fact that you pressed your hand against the door and you felt pushback from the door. You're feeling pushback a little bit before you can feel the door, but the concept is the same. And so this is this great sort of scientific, fun little thing, but it's wonderful for making magic out of it because it's like I said, it's easily adaptable to a story.
I think this has been a blast of a conversation. I learned a lot, and I found a whole bunch of new things to get frightened of. And it's really cool, and I'm pretty sure I've kept you far longer than or perhaps a 40-minute thing. I think we're deep into an hour here, so maybe we should kind of wind up a little bit by letting people know what kind of stuff are you up to? Well, maybe I should back up a little bit and say, some people I have on the podcast are really excited to come on the podcast because it's a chance to talk about some cool things, but also to promote their own books or their own projects. And I don't even know if you have things that you necessarily want to promote because you just love the things, you love the monsters, and you love the stuff so much that you seemed excited to get to talk with me about it, and I've really had a blast. But just in case you do, like if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to or how to contact you, especially if they have more questions about the earth and the ocean and all the horrifying things, what should we let them know?
Well, I give you a couple things, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about it a little bit off air, where this is certainly not initially we thought anyway something that could really kind of talk about in a way that perhaps would work for your podcast. Just because I'm not background in literature, I certainly don't have any books on the, coming out, this kind of thing. What I will say though is, if you did want to ever ask me any questions, it's hard to not find me on Google. That's something I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I can't hide. I am actually at Florida Southwestern State College. I'm an assistant vice president here, so my name is on a lot of different pages and stuff. And my background has sort of put me through a lot of different ways and things. I would say that the thing I would want to plug most, perhaps, is something you've got upcoming that I know we've been working on too. We're still very much working on having you come down here and do that event for us, but also. You've got another podcast coming up with a couple of my colleagues. I'm very excited for that, coming about a month or so. Professor Brandy George and Professor Amy Trogan, and they're going to bring all kinds of wonderful wizardry from their world and literature backgrounds, including the Inklings and things about fey creatures and fairies and demons and this kind of thing. So I think that's the first thing that comes to my mind. If you want to give me a moment to plug stuff. I will say, though, I would be remiss if I don't mention Giant's Causeway as well. It's something that's sort of near and dear to my heart. And
yeah. Let's. If you can we hang on just for a minute or two to talk about that? Because I mean, the Giant's Causeway. Like if that sounds kind of familiar to listeners, but you can't picture it. It's worth a minute or two just to Google some images. But it's like this. You've got these rocks that are like. Well, they're hexagonal. They're like these hexagonal columns, and they're in Ireland, right? Is it?
Yes, Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland, yeah, okay. And there's just a whole bunch of these columns that look like they would be straight out of like a Ridley Scott film or maybe some sort of Star Wars thing. Or I don't really know. They don't even look like they belong on planet Earth. And then they're all just stacked up in this beautiful kind, well, like a causeway or this kind of this strange kind of ridge, even though they're scattered out more, like they're at different heights, and it looks so geometric, and it looks made by ancient giants or ancient gods. So fill us in on what we're looking at when we see this thing.
Yeah, it's one that, you know, I've always really had a fondness for, and I think for several reasons. And so I'll sort of wind this story into the geology at the end, maybe save it for the bang at the end here. But one of the reasons it's connected to me is I grew up in New Jersey, and if you are a geologist or have a geology background, the fun thing to say is, you know, if someone asks you, have you ever been to Ireland? And you haven't, you just say, well, no, but I've been to New Jersey. It's the same thing. And people kind of look at you funny, but I mean, geologically speaking, it's correct for the most part. It was formed in the same area, same time, this kind of thing. And to the point, about a mile away from my house that I grew up in was a mountain, ironically called High Mountain, which was just so we're clear, it's a mountain if it's more than 1,000 feet. If it's not 1,000 feet, it's a hill. This mountain was 1,004 feet, and it was called High Mountain. So anyway, if you climb up this desperately high mountain, you will find near the top of them, about maybe 700, 800 feet up along the side, you will see that same sort of thing, that hexagonal rocks. They're much smaller, much less impressive, but exactly the same thing. And so before I lead into the geology, then the other part that has always been, you know, I had a fondness for is the story that's been put to Giant's Causeway and why it has its name, Giant's Causeway. And it has to do with this character by the name of Fionn McCool. Don't ask me to spell it, but he is basically this guy he lives in Northern Ireland. He's a giant, and he has a wife who's a giant, and he wants to fight this other giant who lives in Scotland. So he's going to build this bridge to Scotland, and then as he's building the bridge, which is Giant's Causeway, of course, he discovers that this other giant from Scotland, I forget the name now, it's been a while since I read the story, this other giant is much bigger and scarier than he is, and so he doesn't think he can win the fight, you know. And so he's kind of like, what do I do now? I don't, you know, he's kind of scaredy cat about this, and so his wife has this brilliant idea, because now this other giant is coming. He's coming for him. He's coming to the house of Fionn McCool to fight him, right? And so the wife says, well, here, quick, put on this diaper from our baby. And, you know, the husband, Fionn McCool, is like, what, you want me to do what now? And the wife is just trust me, put on the diaper and lay on the floor and start acting like a baby. And so the other giant shows up at the house and, you know, I'm here to see Fionn McCool kind of thing. And the wife says, well, he's not home right now. Can I get you anything? You know, and he's, well, I'm here for a fight, you know, and the wife says, well, he's not here, but that's his baby over there on the floor. So he'll be back in a little while though. And it's at that point that the other giant from Scotland realizes, oh, wait a minute, if that's the baby, how big is Fionn McCool, right? And so this is played out, and then Fionn McCool lives to see another day, right? So this is the story that they tell you. Any kind of Irish, you know, tour bus that you get on, they'll tell you this at some point, some sort of version of that. And so when I was in Ireland, I got to hear this story, and the fellow who was our tour guide there, whose name was Tom O'Toole. I'm not kidding. I thought that was perfect. He tells us this story, and then he knew that I was a geologist, and so he asked me about it, and it was a lot of fun to sort of talk out this combination story of what the legend was, and then what you know, how that forms. And so the thing about it that makes people right away tell a story about it, or want to tell a story, or explain it in a human way, is that, for sure, go look at those photos of Giant's Causeway, and they look like something that should have been built by people. There's no way those things could have been built by nature. That doesn't make any sense. It's too perfect. It's too right. Sad to say, though, it is nature. That's exactly what it looks like. It's very normal. It's things, it's called columnar jointing. It happens with a rock called basalt. And when it's under immense pressure for it to cleave or break, and to be under immense pressure means it is basically that rock was basically at the root of a super volcano or stratovolcano in geologic history. And so it cracked under that weight, and that's the way it cracks. There are patterns that exist in nature. It's very normal. They don't look normal when we see them, but when we think of it, a lot of things don't look normal when we see them. Sometimes, though, we even give them names that make them sound not normal when they are. For example, a UFO, right? People ask me, have you ever seen a UFO? I say, yeah, all the time. And they're shocked.
Yeah, every time I see a bird I don't know the name of, that's technically a UFO.
Exactly. You got it, Josh. That's right. It's unidentified, can't identify it. Yep, it's a UFO. And so, but yeah, so those are, to me, are very interesting because I love to hear how we weave a story on something when we don't know, we don't have an explanation. And even when we do have an explanation, if it doesn't quite make enough sense for us because we don't have the background for it. And that's no disrespect to anybody. To be able to have those explanations, you'd have to be an expert in everything, right? And none of us are experts in everything. I think my dad is, though. I think most dads are, actually. So they always know all the answers. And if not, they just say, go ask your mom. She knows all the answers. So maybe your mom knows all the answers. But anyway, so yeah, I have to just mention that one. It's one of my more favored ones.
Yeah, it's so many cool things to check out here, and yeah, the fear that we might take the magic out of some of these things. I think we don't have to fear that at all, because I think if anything, this episode has kind of will have made listeners as interested, if not more interested, in all these things as it has me. So it's been a blast. It's been a lot of fun. I had a feeling it was going to be this cool when we first started chatting, which is why I wanted to cut us off and save some of this for the podcast, and I'm glad we did. Yeah, and I'm looking for, and I got to thank you again for kind of reaching out and getting me connected with Florida Southwestern State College for some cool events and connecting with your other faculty members. Yeah, I think that upcoming episode in which we cover fairies and demons and essentially the crossover. There are quite a bit of crossovers there. I think that one's going to be a lot of fun too. When we finally get to do a live event, that's going to be a blast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know we definitely ran long, so I'm just going to give my I'll finish off here by giving my favorite plug to my favorite monsters for you. We've talked about it in the past, so I just got to get it on air that my two favorite monsters, I would have to say, are Godzilla and the Wendigo, although a werewolf, so the Wolfman is a close third because I love that movie. But Godzilla and Wendigo, so we've got it on record.
Did any of those scare you as a kid?
The original Godzilla film, black and white 1954 version, if you watch it at night in the dark, it still does a really good job. It's black and white, of course, and so there's that layer that makes it difficult to see exactly what it is you're looking at, and it's sort of ominous. I remember the first time I saw it, I think I was about 11 years old, and I had already been introduced to Godzilla before with a lot of the campy sort of stuff that they did in the rubber suit type fun, weird things they did in the 60s and 70s. So I had seen that, and I was blown away by how scary it was, and quite a bit. So I think it still holds up pretty well because it does a good job of utilizing the black and white, to its advantage. So that for sure. The Wendigo, I was actually first introduced, perhaps I would say in a bastardized way, because I was introduced to it from Marvel Comics.
Oh yeah, he was great in there. I think that's the first time I encountered him. No, maybe Lovecraft, but that one was unclear to me. But the Marvel Comics one is so fun. To this day, when I have dreams of running on all fours, I call it running like Wendigo, because how he ran like this ape. He was really cool.
Yeah, it was fun, there, and they sort of give him a Wolfman kind of look, but then when I learned about the Wendigo elsewhere, and well, wow, this is really drastically different from what Marvel did with it, and it's just all the creepier.
Yeah, and there's this brilliant what got Lovecraft inspired by this brilliant writer named Algernon Blackwood, who I don't think gets enough readers because he's just mind-blowingly good. He wrote this Wendigo story that will just it's so odd and it's so convincing that he had to have heard it from locals and then translated it into his own because it is the most bizarre story that'll just rock your world. Man, we got to do a whole Wendigo episode. I don't think we've done a Wendigo episode on this show. Anyway, we definitely have to do Godzilla, but I was saving that for the live event down in Florida since you had requested that one. And then you throw Wolfman in there as one of your favorites.
Yep, I love the Wolfman. My favorite, the 1941 film is just fantastic, and I love the 2010. It gets a lot of negative reviews toward it, but I think that was a pretty good remake of it too. I really enjoy that one as well.
Yeah, with Benicio del Toro as the
That's
Wolfman.
Anthony
Yeah.
Hopkins. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, strangely, I think Benicio del Toro. I haven't done the official research to prove this, but from all my movie watching, I think I'm right about this. That his first stint as Wolfman was in one of Pee Wee Herman's movies, Big Top Pee Wee, in which he was one of the circus freaks who
Really?
landed out of the tornado. He's just a background character. I don't even know if he has a line or two in it, but we're watching him, and my wife is like, "That's Benicio del Toro as the Wolfman." I was like, "No, it is not." And then you look close, like, "My God, it is!" And he's in the credits. So I guess the Wolfman, the 2010 people watched Big Top Pee Wee and thought, "That's our man."
Yeah, it was inspired, right?
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, I think whatever the film does or doesn't do overall, it gets the images and the atmosphere just right, and so I think it did it justice.
Yeah, I
So,
agree.
but the Wolfman's the most common one, I think, for the favorite monster. Well, I definitely have kept you well deep into your time, and you probably have people emailing you and knocking on the door and everything, trying to get you back to work, because this is a crazy time to be involved in college, and I'm sure you've got a lot stacked up. So I just want to let you know I really appreciate the time you've given me on the podcast. This has been a lot of fun, so thanks again.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's been great to be on this show, and I look forward to many future episodes. I get to listen to you talk about all kinds of cool monsters.